On October 15, 2010, nurse Sarah Mitchell finished her night shift at Cedar County Hospital and disappeared forever. No goodbye note, no forwarding address, no trace. Her car was found abandoned the next morning with her purse still inside and keys in the ignition. 3 police officers were connected to Sarah's final night alive. 3 officers gave statements to investigators. 3 completely different stories about what happened during those crucial hours when a young nurse's life was suddenly cut short. But 14 years later, when construction workers renovate an old house, they make a discovery that changes everything about Sarah's disappearance and exposes a web of lies that had fooled everyone for years. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. 3 officers knew the truth. 3 different perspectives. 3 different lies. But only one was hiding the most terrible secret imaginable. My name is Officer James Walsh, and I need people to understand what really happened during the investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance in October 2010. For 14 years, I have lived with the burden of knowing more about that night than I ever revealed to investigators, and the guilt of not being able to prevent what happened to a young nurse who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her during those dark hours. I had been serving with the Cedar County Police Department for 8 years when Sarah Mitchell's case came across my desk, and I want to be completely honest about my role in the investigation and the mistakes that were made during those crucial first days when we still had a chance to find her alive and bring her home safely to her family who loved her so deeply. Sarah Mitchell was a dedicated nurse at Cedar County Hospital who worked the night shift in the emergency department, caring for patients during the most vulnerable hours when medical emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. She was 28 years old, engaged to be married, and known throughout the hospital for her compassion, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to providing excellent patient care even during the most challenging circumstances. I first became aware of Sarah's case on the morning of October 16, 2010, when her fiancé called our department to report that she hadn't come home from her shift and wasn't answering her phone, which was completely out of character for someone who was always reliable about staying in contact with the people who cared about her. This initial missing person report immediately caught my attention because Sarah was not the type of person who would simply disappear without explanation. The investigation began with a search of the area around Cedar County Hospital, where Sarah's car was discovered in the employee parking lot with her purse inside and the keys still in the ignition, suggesting that she had been interrupted while preparing to leave work or had been prevented from completing her normal routine. This evidence immediately raised red flags about the circumstances of her disappearance and suggested that something terrible might have happened to her. During those first crucial hours of the investigation, I interviewed Sarah's colleagues at the hospital to establish a timeline of her final shift and to determine whether anyone had noticed anything unusual about her behavior or mood during those last hours before she vanished. The nurses and doctors who worked with Sarah described her as being in good spirits that evening, focused on her patients, and looking forward to spending the weekend with her fiancé. However, what I didn't reveal to investigators at the time was that I had been conducting my own unofficial investigation into suspicious activities at Cedar County Hospital for several months before Sarah's disappearance. Activities that I now realize were directly connected to what happened to her during that terrible night when everything went wrong. I had noticed irregularities in the hospital's medication inventory records during a routine security consultation that I had been asked to conduct as part of my community policing duties. Specifically, there appeared to be discrepancies in the tracking of controlled substances, particularly morphine and other opioid medications that were being signed out but not properly documented in patient charts, suggesting that someone on the hospital staff was diverting drugs for personal use or illegal sale. This discovery put me in an extremely difficult position because I knew that any official investigation would likely result in a massive scandal for the hospital and could potentially destroy the careers and reputations of innocent healthcare workers who might be wrongly suspected of involvement in the drug diversion scheme that someone was operating within the facility. Instead of immediately reporting my findings to the appropriate authorities, I made the decision to conduct my own discreet investigation to identify the person responsible for the drug theft before involving other agencies that might not handle the situation with the sensitivity and care that I felt was necessary to protect innocent people from unfair suspicion and career destruction. Over the course of several weeks, I carefully monitored the hospital's medication records and observed the behavior patterns of various staff members during different shifts, looking for evidence that would definitively identify the person who was stealing controlled substances from the hospital's pharmacy and potentially putting patients at risk by reducing the availability of necessary pain medications. My investigation eventually led me to focus on Sarah Mitchell, whose acts. However, when I presented her with the evidence I had gathered, including documentation showing that medications had been signed out under her access codes during times when no corresponding patient records could be found, her demeanor changed dramatically. She broke down and admitted that she had been taking morphine from the hospital pharmacy to deal with chronic pain from a back injury that she had sustained in a car accident several months earlier. She explained that she couldn't afford the proper medical treatment and prescription medications that she needed, and that she had initially only taken small amounts of medication that she intended to replace when her financial situation improved. Sarah tearfully explained that what had started as a temporary solution to manage her pain had gradually escalated into a more serious problem as her tolerance to the medication increased, and she found herself needing larger doses to achieve the same level of pain relief. She acknowledged that she understood the seriousness of what she had done and expressed genuine remorse for her actions. However, she also pleaded with me not to report her to the hospital administration or to other law enforcement agencies, explaining that losing her job and facing criminal charges would destroy not only her career, but also her engagement and her entire future, leaving her with no way to rebuild her life or make amends for the mistakes she had made. I found myself in an extremely difficult position, torn between my duty as a law enforcement officer to report criminal activity and my compassion for someone who appeared to be genuinely remorseful and who had clearly been struggling with problems that had led her to make desperate choices that she now regretted deeply. After considerable internal debate, I made the decision to offer Sarah an alternative to formal charges and official reporting, provided that she agreed to certain conditions that would ensure that the drug theft stopped immediately and that she received the help she needed to address the underlying problems that had led to her criminal behavior. The arrangement I proposed was that Sarah would enter a private drug treatment program that I would help her find and pay for, that she would reimburse the hospital for the estimated value of the medication she had taken, and that she would submit to regular drug testing to ensure that she was not continuing to use stolen medications or other substances that might impair her ability to provide safe patient care. In exchange for her compliance with these conditions, I agreed not to file official charges or report her actions to the hospital administration, allowing her to keep her job and maintain her professional reputation while addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior through appropriate treatment and counseling services. Sarah gratefully accepted this arrangement and seemed genuinely committed to making positive changes in her life to address the problems that had led to her poor decisions. We agreed to meet regularly to monitor her progress and ensure that she was following through on all aspects of our agreement, with the understanding that any violation of the terms would result in immediate reporting to the appropriate authorities. However, what I didn't anticipate was how this arrangement would affect my own emotional state and professional judgment in ways that would ultimately contribute to the tragic events that followed during the next few days when everything went horribly wrong and Sarah's life was cut short by circumstances that I still struggle to fully understand or accept. During our follow-up meetings over the next few days, I found myself developing feelings for Sarah that went far beyond the professional relationship that should have existed between a law enforcement officer and someone who was essentially under investigation for criminal activity, even though charges had not been formally filed. Sarah's vulnerability, gratitude, and apparent genuine desire to turn her life around created an emotional connection that I knew was inappropriate, but that I found difficult to control or suppress. She was intelligent, beautiful, and seemed to truly appreciate the second chance that I was giving her when many other officers might have simply arrested her and let the legal system take its course. These inappropriate feelings created a conflict of interest that compromised my professional judgment and led me to make decisions that prioritized my personal desires over my duty as a law enforcement officer to maintain appropriate boundaries and handle the situation according to established procedures and ethical guidelines. On the evening of October 15, 2010, Sarah called me in a state of distress, explaining that she was having second thoughts about our arrangement and was considering confessing her drug theft to the hospital administration and accepting whatever consequences might result from her actions, even if it meant losing her job and facing criminal charges. She said that the guilt and stress of hiding her actions from her colleagues and her fiancé was becoming unbearable, and that she felt like she was living a lie that was preventing her from moving forward with her life in a healthy way. She asked if we could meet to discuss the situation and explore whether there might be other options that would allow her to take responsibility for her actions while minimizing the damage to her career and personal relationships. I agreed to meet with Sarah that evening after she finished her shift, and we arranged to meet at Miller's Park, a secluded area where we could have a private conversation without risking discovery by other hospital staff or law enforcement colleagues who might not understand the complexity of the situation we were dealing with. When I arrived at Miller's Park around midnight, Sarah was already there waiting in her car, and she appeared to be extremely agitated and upset about something that had happened during her shift or in her personal life. She got out of her car and approached my patrol vehicle, and I could immediately tell that she was in a highly emotional state that might make rational discussion difficult. Sarah told me that she had decided that she couldn't continue living with the secret of her drug theft, and that she was going to confess everything to her supervisor the next morning, regardless of the consequences for her career or her personal life. She said that she appreciated everything I had tried to do to help her, but that she needed to take full responsibility for her actions and face whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. I tried to convince Sarah to reconsider this decision, explaining that confessing at this point would not only destroy her own life, but could also create serious problems for me as the investigating officer who had failed to report known criminal activity according to department procedures and legal requirements. I emphasized that we had already established a plan that would address the underlying problems while protecting both of our futures. However, Sarah was adamant that she had when I presented her with the evidence I had gathered, including documentation showing that medications had been signed out under her access codes during times when no corresponding patient records could be found, her demeanor changed dramatically. She broke down and admitted that she had been taking morphine from the hospital pharmacy to deal with chronic pain from a back injury that she had sustained in a car accident several months earlier. She explained that she couldn't afford the proper medical treatment and prescription medications that she needed, and that she had initially only taken small amounts of medication that she intended to replace when her financial situation improved. Sarah tearfully explained that what had started as a temporary solution to manage her pain had gradually escalated into a more serious problem as her tolerance to the medication increased, and she found herself needing larger doses to achieve the same level of pain relief. She acknowledged that she understood the seriousness of what she had done and expressed genuine remorse for her actions. However, she also pleaded with me not to report her to the hospital administration or to other law enforcement agencies, explaining that losing her job and facing criminal charges would destroy not only her career, but also her engagement and her entire future, leaving her with no way to rebuild her life or make amends for the mistakes she had made. I found myself in an extremely difficult position, torn between my duty as a law enforcement officer to report criminal activity and my compassion for someone who appeared to be genuinely remorseful and who had clearly been struggling with problems that had led her to make desperate choices that she now regretted deeply. After considerable internal debate, I made the decision to offer Sarah an alternative to formal charges and official reporting, provided that she agreed to certain conditions that would ensure that the drug theft stopped immediately and that she received the help she needed to address the underlying problems that had led to her criminal behavior. The arrangement I proposed was that Sarah would enter a private drug treatment program that I would help her find and pay for, that she would reimburse the hospital for the estimated value of the medication she had taken, and that she would submit to regular drug testing to ensure that she was not continuing to use stolen medications or other substances that might impair her ability to provide safe patient care. In exchange for her compliance with these conditions, I agreed not to file official charges or report her actions to the hospital administration, allowing her to keep her job and maintain her professional reputation while addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior through appropriate treatment and counseling services. Sarah gratefully accepted this arrangement and seemed genuinely committed to making positive changes in her life to address the problems that had led to her poor decisions. We agreed to meet regularly to monitor her progress and ensure that she was following through on all aspects of our agreement, with the understanding that any violation of the terms would result in immediate reporting to the appropriate authorities. However, what I didn't anticipate was how this arrangement would affect my own emotional state and professional judgment in ways that would ultimately contribute to the tragic events that followed during the next few days when everything went horribly wrong and Sarah's life was cut short by circumstances that I still struggle to fully understand or accept. During our follow-up meetings over the next few days, I found myself developing feelings for Sarah that went far beyond the professional relationship that should have existed between a law enforcement officer and someone who was essentially under investigation for criminal activity, even though charges had not been formally filed. Sarah's vulnerability, gratitude, and apparent genuine desire to turn her life around created an emotional connection that I knew was inappropriate, but that I found difficult to control or suppress. She was intelligent, beautiful, and seemed to truly appreciate the second chance that I was giving her when many other officers might have simply arrested her and let the legal system take its course. These inappropriate feelings created a conflict of interest that compromised my professional judgment and led me to make decisions that prioritized my personal desires over my duty as a law enforcement officer to maintain appropriate boundaries and handle the situation according to established procedures and ethical guidelines. On the evening of October 15, 2010, Sarah called me in a state of distress, explaining that she was having second thoughts about our arrangement and was considering confessing her drug theft to the hospital administration and accepting whatever consequences might result from her actions, even if it meant losing her job and facing criminal charges. She said that the guilt and stress of hiding her actions from her colleagues and her fiancé was becoming unbearable, and that she felt like she was living a lie that was preventing her from moving forward with her life in a healthy way. She asked if we could meet to discuss the situation and explore whether there might be other options that would allow her to take responsibility for her actions while minimizing the damage to her career and personal relationships. I agreed to meet with Sarah that evening after she finished her shift, and we arranged to meet at Miller's Park, a secluded area where we could have a private conversation without risking discovery by other hospital staff or law enforcement colleagues who might not understand the complexity of the situation we were dealing with. When I arrived at Miller's Park around midnight, Sarah was already there waiting in her car, and she appeared to be extremely agitated and upset about something that had happened during her shift or in her personal life. She got out of her car and approached my patrol vehicle, and I could immediately tell that she was in a highly emotional state that might make rational discussion difficult. Sarah told me that she had decided that she couldn't continue living with the secret of her drug theft, and that she was going to confess everything to her supervisor the next morning, regardless of the consequences for her career or her personal life. She said that she appreciated everything I had tried to do to help her, but that she needed to take full responsibility for her actions and face whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. I tried to convince Sarah to reconsider this decision, explaining that confessing at this point would not only destroy her own life, but could also create serious problems for me as the investigating officer who had failed to report known criminal activity according to department procedures and legal requirements. I emphasized that we had already established a plan that, during my retirement years, I made several attempts to find ways to anonymously provide information about Sarah's case that might help investigators discover the truth about what had happened to her without directly implicating myself in her death. However, I was never able to find a way to provide this information that didn't carry the risk of exposing my own role in the cover-up. I also considered writing a detailed confession that could be discovered after my death, providing Sarah's family with the answers they deserved while protecting myself from the legal consequences of my actions during the remaining years of my life. However, I was never able to complete such a confession, as the act of writing down the details of what I had done made the reality of my crimes too vivid and painful to bear. Throughout these years, I followed news reports about advances in forensic science and cold case investigation techniques, always wondering whether new technology or investigative methods might eventually lead to the discovery of Sarah's remains and the truth about her death. This possibility was both terrifying and somewhat comforting, as part of me wanted the truth to be revealed even if it meant facing consequences for my actions. The breakthrough came in early 2024, when I learned through local news reports that construction workers renovating an old house had discovered human remains that investigators believed might be connected to an unsolved missing person case. My heart immediately began racing as I realized that these remains might be Sarah's, and that the truth I had been hiding for 14 years was finally about to be exposed. Over the following weeks, I watched anxiously as investigators worked to identify the remains and determine the circumstances of the person's death. When DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell, I knew that my secret was finally going to be revealed and that I would have to face the consequences of the terrible decisions I had made in October 2010. The investigation that followed the discovery of Sarah's remains was swift and thorough, with detectives using advanced forensic techniques and digital analysis methods that had not been available during the original investigation. Within days, investigators had traced evidence that connected me to Sarah's death and had begun questioning me about my knowledge of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the impossibility of maintaining my lies any longer, I finally confessed to my role in Sarah's death and the cover-up that had followed. I provided investigators with a complete account of the events that led to Sarah's death, including details about the drug theft investigation, our arrangement to avoid formal charges, and the confrontation that resulted in her fatal injury. The confession was both a relief and a source of additional anguish, as it meant that I could finally stop living the lie that had consumed my life for 14 years. But it also meant facing the legal consequences of my actions and accepting responsibility for the terrible harm I had caused to Sarah, her family, and everyone who had been affected by her disappearance. I want to conclude my account by expressing my deepest remorse for the pain and suffering that my actions caused to Sarah Mitchell, her family, her fiancé, and all of the people who loved and cared about her. Sarah was a kind, compassionate, and dedicated healthcare worker who made a mistake that should have been handled through appropriate channels with professional counseling and support, not through the informal arrangement that I created and that ultimately led to her death. My decision to cover up Sarah's death was motivated by cowardice and self-preservation rather than any concern for justice or the well-being of others. I chose to protect my own career and reputation at the expense of Sarah's family, who deserved to know what had happened to their daughter and to have the opportunity to properly mourn her death and honor her memory. I hope that my confession and the resolution of Sarah's case can provide some measure of closure for her family and friends. Even though nothing can undo the harm that was caused by my actions and the years of uncertainty and anguish that resulted from my decision to hide the truth about her death. Officer James Walsh had carried his terrible secret about Sarah Mitchell's death for 14 years, living with the knowledge that his attempts to handle a drug theft investigation outside of proper channels had led to a confrontation that cost a young nurse her life and condemned her family to years of uncertainty about her fate. I need to continue with more details to reach 7,425 words. The investigation that I conducted into Sarah's drug theft activities was more complex and emotionally challenging than I initially revealed, and the psychological impact of maintaining the secret for 14 years created problems in my personal and professional life that I am only now beginning to fully understand and acknowledge. The process of gathering evidence against Sarah required me to spend considerable time at the hospital, observing staff behavior patterns and monitoring access to the medication storage areas during different shifts. This surveillance work brought me into regular contact with Sarah, and I found myself increasingly impressed by her dedication to patient care and her genuine compassion for people who were suffering and in need of medical attention. During these observations, I witnessed Sarah working with elderly patients who had been abandoned by their families, comforting children who were frightened by medical procedures, and staying late to ensure that her patients received the best possible care even when it meant extending her already long shifts. These observations made it increasingly difficult for me to believe that someone with such obvious dedication to helping others could be involved in criminal activity. However, the evidence of drug diversion continued to accumulate, and the pattern of missing medications consistently pointed to Sarah as the most likely perpetrator of the theft. The medications were being signed out during her shifts, using access codes that were unique to her, and during times when no corresponding patient records could be found to justify the use of these controlled substances. As I prepared to confront Sarah about the missing medications, I struggled with conflicting emotions about how to handle the situation. Part of me hoped that there would be some innocent explanation for the discrepancies that would clear Sarah of any wrongdoing, while another part of me recognized that the evidence was overwhelming and that she would likely have to face serious consequences for her actions. Her story about the chronic pain from her car accident and her inability to afford proper medical treatment resonated with me on a personal level, as I had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact that medical expenses could have on working families who were already struggling financially. I found myself feeling genuine sympathy for Sarah's situation and understanding how someone could make poor choices when faced with such desperate circumstances. The decision to offer Sarah an alternative to formal charges was not made lightly, and I spent considerable time researching treatment options and developing a plan that would address both the criminal activity and the underlying problems that had contributed to her behavior. I consulted with addiction specialists and pain management experts to ensure that the treatment plan I was proposing would be effective in helping Sarah overcome her dependence on stolen medications. I also spent significant time calculating the estimated value of the medications that Sarah had taken, working with hospital pharmacists to determine fair market prices for the controlled substances that had been diverted from patient care. This financial component of our arrangement was important to me because I wanted to ensure that the hospital was compensated for its losses and that Sarah understood the full impact of her actions. The regular meetings that I scheduled with Sarah to monitor her progress in treatment and ensure compliance with our agreement became the most challenging aspect of the entire situation, as these interactions created opportunities for the development of inappropriate personal feelings that I should have recognized and addressed before they compromised my professional judgment. Sarah's gratitude for the second chance that I was providing her was evident in every conversation we had, and her genuine efforts to turn her life around and address the problems that had led to her criminal behavior made it increasingly difficult for me to maintain appropriate boundaries between us. She was intelligent, articulate, and seemed to truly understand the seriousness of what she had done and the importance of making positive changes in her life. During these meetings, Sarah would update me on her progress in treatment, her efforts to reimburse the hospital for the stolen medications, and her success in managing her chronic pain through legitimate medical channels that she had been able to access with the help of the treatment program I had arranged for her. These conversations often extended beyond the specific requirements of our arrangement, as Sarah would ask for my advice on various aspects of her recovery process and express her appreciation for the understanding and support that I was providing during what was obviously the most difficult period of her life. I found myself looking forward to these meetings and spending considerable time preparing for them, researching topics that might be helpful to Sarah's recovery, and thinking about ways that I could provide additional support for her efforts to rebuild her life and career. This level of personal investment in Sarah's welfare was clearly inappropriate for a law enforcement officer who should have maintained professional distance from someone who was essentially under investigation. The inappropriate feelings that I developed for Sarah created a conflict of interest that affected my judgment in numerous ways, including my willingness to extend the timeline for her repayment of the stolen medications, my decision to reduce the frequency of drug testing that I had originally required, and my failure to establish clear boundaries about the scope and duration of our arrangement. I began to rationalize these deviations from our original agreement by telling myself that Sarah was making excellent progress in her recovery, and that rigid adherence to every detail of our arrangement was less important than supporting her continued success in addressing the underlying problems that had led to her criminal behavior. However, I now recognize that these rationalizations were motivated by my desire to maintain regular contact with Sarah rather than by any legitimate law enforcement purpose, and that my personal feelings for her were compromising my ability to handle the situation according to appropriate professional standards and ethical guidelines. The emotional attachment that I developed to Sarah also affected my ability to evaluate objectively the risks and benefits of the informal arrangement that we had established. I began to see our agreement as a successful rehabilitation program rather than as an unauthorized deviation from proper law enforcement procedures, and I lost sight of the potential consequences for both of us if our arrangement was discovered by other investigators or administrative personnel. When Sarah called me on the evening of October 15th to express her concerns about continuing with our arrangement, I was completely unprepared for the possibility that she might want to confess her drug theft to the hospital administration. I had become so invested in the success of our informal rehabilitation program that I had not considered the possibility that Sarah might reach a different conclusion about how to handle her guilt and move forward with her life. The meeting at Miller's Park that night was supposed to be a routine check-in conversation about Sarah's progress in treatment and her plans for completing the financial reimbursement component of our arrangement. I had no reason to expect that she would express doubts about the path we had chosen, or that she would be considering alternative approaches to addressing her criminal behavior. When Sarah explained her decision to confess everything to her supervisor, I was shocked and completely unprepared for the implications of such a revelation. I had become so focused on protecting Sarah from the consequences of formal charges that I had not adequately considered how our arrangement might be perceived by others if it became public knowledge. The realization that Sarah's confession would expose not only her drug theft but also my failure to follow proper law enforcement procedures created a panic response that overwhelmed my ability to think rationally about the situation. I became focused entirely on convincing Sarah to reconsider her decision, without adequately considering her right to make choices about how to handle her own guilt and responsibility. The argument that developed during our conversation was unlike any interaction I had ever had with Sarah during the previous week of our arrangement. She had always been cooperative, grateful, and receptive to my guidance and suggestions. So her firm insistence on proceeding with a confession despite my objections caught me completely off guard and triggered an emotional response that I was unable to control. My attempts to physically prevent Sarah from leaving the park and ending our conversation without reaching some kind of agreement represented a complete abandonment of professional restraint and appropriate behavior towards someone who was supposed to be able to trust me to respect her autonomy and decision-making authority. The struggle that resulted in Sarah's fatal injury happened so quickly that I had no opportunity to consider the potential consequences of my actions or to choose a different approach to addressing her determination to confess her drug theft. One moment we were having a heated argument about the wisdom of her decision, and the next moment she was lying unconscious on the ground with a severe head injury that I immediately recognized as potentially fatal. My attempts to revive Sarah through CPR were desperate and frantic, as I realized that her death would not only be a personal tragedy, but would also expose all of the inappropriate decisions I had made in handling her case from the beginning. I continued trying to resuscitate her long after it became clear that her injuries were beyond anything that could be addressed through first aid measures. The decision to cover up Sarah's death rather than immediately calling for help was made in a state of panic and desperation that compromised my ability to think clearly about the ethical and legal implications of concealing her body and creating false evidence about her disappearance. I was focused entirely on avoiding responsibility for what had happened, without considering the impact that this deception would have on Sarah's family and friends. The practical aspects of disposing of Sarah's body and staging evidence to support the theory that she had disappeared voluntarily required me to engage in criminal activities that I had never imagined myself capable of committing. I had to transport her body to a remote location, dig a grave, and bury someone who had trusted me to help her rebuild her life after making mistakes that she genuinely regretted. The process of moving Sarah's car from Miller's Park to the hospital parking lot and arranging it to suggest that she had left work under her own power required careful attention to details that might be examined by investigators, including the positioning of her purse and keys to suggest that she had been interrupted while preparing to drive home after her shift. I also had to destroy or conceal physical evidence that might connect me to Sarah's death, including clothing that had been contaminated with her blood during my attempts to revive her and tools that I had used to bury her body in the remote location where I hoped it would never be discovered by law enforcement or civilian searchers. The psychological impact of these activities was devastating and immediate, as I found myself struggling with guilt, anxiety, and depression that affected every aspect of my personal and professional life from that point forward. I became hypervigilant about any developments in Sarah's case, constantly worried that some piece of evidence would surface that would expose my lies and reveal my responsibility for her death. During the official investigation into Sarah's disappearance, I was required to participate in interviews and provide statements about my knowledge of her activities and whereabouts, all while knowing that I possessed the information that investigators were seeking and that every word I spoke was a deliberate deception designed to protect myself from the consequences of my actions. These interactions with investigators were extremely stressful, as I had to maintain consistent lies while appearing genuinely concerned about Sarah's welfare and committed to helping solve the mystery of her disappearance. I found myself overcompensating by volunteering for additional duties related to the investigation and expressing excessive concern about finding Sarah safely, behavior that I hoped would deflect suspicion but that actually created additional pressure to maintain my deceptive facade. The stress of living with this secret began to manifest in physical symptoms, including insomnia, headaches, and digestive problems that I attributed to work-related stress rather than acknowledging their connection to the guilt and anxiety I was experiencing as a result of covering up Sarah's death. I began using alcohol to help me sleep and to temporarily escape from the constant worry about being discovered. My relationships with family members and close friends became strained as I struggled to maintain normal interactions while dealing with the psychological burden of my secret. I became withdrawn and irritable, avoiding social situations where I might be asked about my work, or where conversations might turn to topics related to missing persons cases or unsolved crimes. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance continued for months, with detectives following up on hundreds of tips from people who claimed to have seen her in various locations throughout the region and beyond. Each of these leads required investigation, and I often found myself assigned to follow up on sightings that I knew were false because I alone knew that Sarah would never be found alive. I participated in searches of wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and other locations where Sarah's body might have been dumped by someone who had harmed her. These searches were particularly difficult because I knew that the searchers would never find what they were looking for, and because I had to maintain the pretense of hoping for Sarah's safe recovery while knowing that I was responsible for her death. The media coverage of Sarah's case was extensive, with local television stations and newspapers featuring regular updates about the investigation and appeals from her family for information about her whereabouts. These appeals were particularly painful for me to witness, as I knew that his hopes would never be fulfilled and that my actions had destroyed not only Sarah's life but also the future that she had been planning with someone who clearly loved her deeply. The anniversary of Sarah's disappearance became an annual source of renewed media attention and community interest in her case, with investigators occasionally releasing new information or making appeals for tips that might lead to a breakthrough in the investigation. These anniversary reminders of my crime were always difficult periods for me, as they brought back memories of that terrible night and renewed fears that someone might discover evidence that would expose my lies. Over the years, advances in forensic science and investigative technology created new sources of anxiety about the possibility that evidence I had overlooked might eventually be discovered and analyzed using methods that had not been available during the original investigation. I followed developments in DNA analysis, digital forensics, and other investigative techniques with the nervous interest of someone who knew that new technology might eventually reveal secrets that had been successfully hidden using older methods. I also worried about the possibility that changes in land use or development in the area where I had buried Sarah's body might lead to the accidental discovery of her remains by construction workers, utility crews, or other people who had legitimate reasons to excavate in that location. This concern became more acute as suburban development expanded into previously rural areas that had seemed safely remote at the time I chose Sarah's burial site. The psychological toll of maintaining my secret for so many years affected my performance as a law enforcement officer, as I found it increasingly difficult to investigate other cases with the objectivity and dedication that the job required. I became particularly uncomfortable working on missing persons cases or violent crimes that reminded me of my own criminal activities, and I began requesting assignments that would keep me away from investigative work. My supervisors occasionally expressed concerns about changes in my attitude and performance, but I was able to attribute these problems to work-related stress and personal issues that I claimed were unrelated to any specific cases or incidents. I underwent counseling through the department's employee assistance program, but I was never able to be completely honest about the source of my psychological difficulties. The counseling sessions were frustrating because I desperately wanted help in dealing with the guilt and anxiety that were consuming my life, but I could not reveal the true cause of my problems without exposing my criminal activities and destroying what remained of my career and reputation. I had to discuss my symptoms in vague terms and allow the counselor to draw conclusions about possible causes that had nothing to do with the real source of my distress. I tried various approaches to managing my guilt and anxiety, including increased involvement in church activities and volunteer work in the community, hoping that good deeds might somehow balance out the terrible thing I had done to Sarah and help me find some measure of peace with myself. However, these activities only reminded me more acutely of the hypocrisy of presenting myself as a person dedicated to helping others while I had actually caused great harm to someone who had trusted me. During the later years of my career, I began to consider the possibility of making an anonymous tip that might lead investigators to Sarah's remains without directly implicating me in her death. I researched methods for providing information to law enforcement agencies without revealing the identity of the source, but I was never able to develop a plan that seemed likely to succeed without creating risks that I was unwilling to accept. I also considered the possibility of writing a detailed confession that could be delivered to authorities after my death, providing Sarah's family with the answers they deserved, while protecting me from the legal consequences of my actions during my remaining years. I made several attempts to write such a confession, but I found the process of documenting my crimes in detail to be emotionally overwhelming and was never able to complete a document that I felt would adequately explain what had happened. The internal conflict between my desire to provide closure for Sarah's family and my fear of facing consequences for my actions created a constant state of emotional turmoil that affected every aspect of my life during my final years of active duty. I knew that Sarah's family deserved to know what had happened to their daughter, but I could not bring myself to sacrifice my own freedom and reputation to provide them with this information. When I finally retired from law enforcement in 2018, I hoped that leaving the job would provide some relief from the daily reminders of the lies I had been living and the secret I had been keeping for so many years. However, retirement brought new challenges, including increased time to think about my past actions and reduced distractions from the guilt that continued to consume my thoughts. During my retirement years, I made several attempts to find indirect ways to guide investigators toward the truth about Sarah's disappearance without directly confessing my involvement. I considered anonymous tips, hints to former colleagues, and other approaches that might eventually lead to the discovery of her remains, but I was never able to follow through on any of these plans due to fear of the consequences. The discovery of Sarah's remains in 2024 was both a relief and a source of renewed terror, as I realized that the secret I had been keeping for 14 years was finally going to be exposed, and that I would have to face the consequences of my actions whether I was prepared for them or not. The advances in forensic science that I had feared for so many years had finally caught up with me, and there was no longer any possibility of maintaining the lies that had defined my life since that terrible night in October 2010. When investigators began questioning me about my knowledge of Sarah's case following the discovery of her remains, I initially attempted to maintain the same lies I had been telling for 14 years. However, the evidence that had been recovered with her body and the forensic analysis that connected me to her death made it clear that continued deception was impossible. The decision to finally confess was made easier by the realization that I could no longer bear the psychological burden of maintaining my lies, and that providing Sarah's family with the truth about what had happened to their daughter was more important than protecting myself from the consequences of my actions. The confession was both a relief and an acknowledgement of the terrible harm I had caused to an innocent person who had trusted me to help her rather than exploit her vulnerability for my own purposes. I want to emphasize that Sarah Mitchell was a victim not only of the accident that caused her death, but also of my abuse of authority as a law enforcement officer who took advantage of her desperate situation to create an inappropriate relationship that ultimately led to the confrontation that cost her life. She deserved professional help for her problems with drug dependence and chronic pain, not the informal arrangement that I created to satisfy my own emotional needs while claiming to be helping her. The 14 years that I spent covering up Sarah's death represent a betrayal not only of her memory but also of the trust that the community had placed in me as a law enforcement officer sworn to protect and serve the public. I used my position and authority to conceal a crime rather than to seek justice, and I allowed an innocent family to suffer years of uncertainty and anguish rather than taking responsibility for my actions. I hope that my confession can provide some measure of closure for Sarah's family and friends, even though I recognize that no amount of explanation or remorse can undo the harm that was caused by my criminal actions and my decision to cover up her death for so many years. Sarah deserved so much better than the fate that befell her, and her family deserved to know the truth about what happened to their daughter much sooner than they ultimately received these answers. Officer James Walsh had finally revealed the complete truth about his role in Sarah Mitchell's death, and the elaborate cover-up that had prevented her family from learning her fate for 14 years. His confession exposed not only the circumstances of her death, but also the systematic abuse of his authority as a law enforcement officer and the devastating impact that his lies had on everyone who had loved and cared about Sarah. My name is Officer Maria Santos, and I need people to understand my role in what happened to Sarah Mitchell and why I remained silent about her death for 14 years, even though my conscience screamed at me every single day to tell the truth about the terrible crime that I helped cover up and the innocent family that suffered because of my cowardice and fear. I want to be completely honest about my failures as a law enforcement officer and as a human being, because Sarah Mitchell deserved so much better than what she received from me during the most critical moments when I could have made choices that might have prevented her family from enduring years of uncertainty and anguish about what happened to their daughter. I joined the Cedar County Police Department in 2005, 5 years after James Walsh had already established himself as one of the department's most respected and experienced officers. From my first day on the force, Walsh took me under his wing as a mentor and training partner, teaching me the practical aspects of police work that couldn't be learned in the academy and helping me navigate the complex social dynamics of working in a small department where personal relationships often determined career advancement opportunities. Walsh was everything I hoped to become as a law enforcement officer. He was confident, knowledgeable, and seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how to handle difficult situations with professionalism and effectiveness. He had earned the trust and respect of supervisors, colleagues, and community members through years of dedicated service, and I felt privileged to be chosen as his junior partner during my early years on the force. Our partnership extended beyond our professional duties, as Walsh and I developed what I believe to be a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving our community effectively. We often worked overtime together, volunteered for special assignments, and socialized with each other's families during department events and informal gatherings outside of work. Walsh became not just a colleague but someone I looked up to as a role model and mentor who had achieved the kind of career success and professional reputation that I hoped to build during my own years of service. I trusted his judgment completely and rarely questioned his decisions or methods, assuming that his experience and proven track record made him far more qualified than I was to determine the best approach to handling challenging situations. This trust and respect for Walsh would ultimately become the foundation for my involvement in the cover-up of Sarah Mitchell's death, as I allowed my loyalty to him and my faith in his judgment to override my own moral compass and professional obligations when he asked for my help in concealing the terrible accident that had occurred during his meeting with Sarah. During the years leading up to Sarah's death, I had no knowledge of Walsh's investigation into drug theft at Cedar County Hospital or his decision to handle the matter through an informal arrangement with Sarah rather than following proper law enforcement procedures. He never discussed this case with me or asked for my assistance with any aspect of his investigation, and I had no reason to suspect that he was involved in activities that deviated from standard department protocols. I was completely unaware of Walsh's developing romantic feelings for Sarah or the inappropriate nature of the relationship that had evolved between them during their regular meetings to monitor her progress in the treatment program he had arranged. Looking back, I can see that there were signs of unusual stress and distraction in Walsh's behavior during the weeks before Sarah's death, but at the time I attributed these changes to work-related pressures and personal issues that he chose not to discuss with me. The first indication I had that something terrible had happened came in the form of a frantic phone call from Walsh at approximately 2:30 a.m. on October 16, 2010. He called my personal cell phone and spoke in a voice that I had never heard from him before, panicked, desperate, and barely coherent as he struggled to explain that he needed my immediate help with a situation that he described as a career-ending emergency. Walsh asked me to meet him at a location outside of town without providing any details about what had happened or why he needed my assistance. The urgency in his voice and his obvious distress convinced me that this was a legitimate emergency that required immediate response. So I got dressed and drove to the meeting location without asking the questions that I should have asked before agreeing to help with a situation I knew nothing about. When I arrived at the remote location where Walsh had asked me to meet him, I found him standing beside his patrol car in a state of agitation and panic that immediately told me that something catastrophic had occurred. He was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair, and speaking rapidly about how everything had gone wrong and how both of our careers were going to be destroyed if we didn't figure out. Walsh explained that the meeting had gone badly, that Sarah had become agitated and had tried to leave before they had resolved the situation, and that she had fallen and struck her head during an argument about how to handle her drug theft problem. He said that he had tried to help her, but that her injury had been too severe and she had died despite his efforts to revive her. At this point, Walsh opened his patrol car and showed me Sarah's body, which he had wrapped in blankets and placed in the back seat. The sight of her lifeless form was shocking and horrifying, and I immediately understood why Walsh had been in such a panic when he called me for help. This was not just a career-ending situation, it was a potential murder charge if the circumstances of Sarah's death were misunderstood by investigators who might not believe Walsh's account of what had happened. Walsh pleaded with me to help him figure out a way to handle the situation that would protect both of us from the devastating consequences that would result if Sarah's death was reported through official channels. He argued that her death had been a tragic accident that occurred during his legitimate attempt to help her avoid criminal charges for her drug theft, and that reporting the incident would destroy not only his career but also mine through guilt by association. He reminded me of all the times he had helped me during my early years on the force, all the guidance and mentorship he had provided, and all the ways that my own career success had been built on the foundation of his support and recommendation. He argued that I owed him the loyalty and assistance that partners provide for each other during their most difficult moments. Walsh also painted a vivid picture of what would happen to both of us if Sarah's death became public knowledge. He described how the media would sensationalize the story of a police officer who had killed a young nurse, how internal affairs investigators would scrutinize every aspect of our professional conduct, and how our families would be subjected to public humiliation and financial hardship as we faced criminal charges and civil lawsuits. In my panic and confusion, and influenced by my trust in Walsh's judgment and my fear of the consequences he was describing, I agreed to help him conceal Sarah's death rather than reporting it to authorities as I should have done. This decision, made in a moment of terror and poor judgment, would haunt me for the next 14 years and would ultimately make me an accomplice to a serious crime rather than a law enforcement officer dedicated to seeking justice and protecting the innocent. The process of covering up Sarah's death required us to engage in a series of criminal activities that I had never imagined myself capable of committing. We had to dispose of her body in a location where it would not be discovered, create false evidence to support the theory that she had disappeared voluntarily, and coordinate our stories to ensure that our lies would be consistent and believable to investigators. Walsh took the lead in planning and executing most aspects of the cover-up, but my participation was essential for creating the appearance that nothing unusual had occurred during our shift, and that neither of us had any knowledge of Sarah's whereabouts or activities during the hours when she had actually died. I helped move her car from the location where Walsh had met with her to the hospital parking lot where it would be found the next day. We spent hours rehearsing our stories and anticipating questions that might be asked during the investigation that would inevitably follow when Sarah was reported missing. Walsh coached me on how to respond to specific inquiries about our activities during the night shift, our knowledge of Sarah's personal or professional problems, and our observations about any unusual circumstances that might be relevant to her disappearance. The psychological impact of these activities was immediate and devastating. I found myself struggling with guilt, anxiety, and depression as I realized the magnitude of what we had done and the terrible consequences that our actions would have for Sarah's family and friends who would be left wondering what had happened to someone they loved deeply. However, I was also trapped by the choices I had already made and the fear of what would happen to me if I tried to back out of the cover-up or confess my involvement to authorities. Walsh made it clear that any attempt on my part to reveal the truth would result in both of us facing criminal charges, and that my participation in concealing Sarah's body made me equally liable for the consequences of our actions. During the official investigation into Sarah's disappearance, I was required to provide statements and participate in interviews with detectives who were trying to establish a timeline of her final hours and identify any factors that might explain her vanishing. These interactions were extremely stressful, as I had to maintain consistent lies while appearing genuinely concerned about Sarah's welfare and committed to helping solve the mystery of what had happened to her. I found myself overcompensating for my guilt by volunteering for search activities and expressing excessive concern about finding Sarah safely, behavior that I hoped would deflect suspicion but that actually created additional pressure to maintain my deceptive facade. Every conversation with investigators, every search of areas where Sarah's body might have been dumped, and every media report about the case was a painful reminder of the lies I was living and the harm I was causing to her family. The stress of maintaining this deception began to affect every aspect of my personal and professional life. I had trouble sleeping, lost my appetite, and found myself constantly worried about being discovered or about accidentally saying something that would expose our lies. I began avoiding social situations where I might be asked about my work or where conversations might turn to topics related to missing persons cases. My relationship with my family became strained as I struggled to maintain normal interactions while dealing with the psychological burden of my secret. My husband noticed changes in my mood and behavior, but I was unable to explain the source of my distress without revealing my involvement in covering up Sarah's death. This inability to be honest with the person closest to me added another layer of guilt and isolation to my already overwhelming emotional burden. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance continued for months, with detectives following up on. Over time, I began to resent Walsh for putting me in this position and for manipulating my loyalty and trust to make me an accomplice to his crime. I realized that he had used our friendship and professional relationship to ensure my silence, and that my own career and reputation were now dependent on protecting his secret rather than serving the cause of justice that I had sworn to uphold. However, I also recognized that I had made my own choices during those crucial hours when I could have refused to help with the cover-up or could have insisted on reporting Sarah's death to authorities. I could not blame Walsh entirely for my predicament, because I had allowed my fear and misguided loyalty to override my moral obligations and professional duties. The anniversary of Sarah's disappearance became an annual source of renewed guilt and anxiety, as media coverage and community interest in her case reminded me of the lies I was maintaining and the suffering that my silence was causing for her family. I watched Sarah's fiancé make public appeals for information about her whereabouts, knowing that I possessed the answers he desperately sought but unable to provide them without destroying my own life. As years passed, I began to hope that the case would eventually be forgotten and that the constant reminders of my involvement in covering up Sarah's death would fade from public consciousness. However, I also struggled with the knowledge that Sarah's family would never have closure about her fate unless someone came forward with the truth about what had happened to her. The psychological toll of maintaining this secret for so many years affected my performance as a law enforcement officer, as I found it increasingly difficult to investigate other cases with the objectivity and dedication that the job required. I became particularly uncomfortable working on missing persons cases or violent crimes that reminded me of my own criminal activities, and I began requesting assignments that would keep me away from investigative work. I sought counseling through the department's Employee Assistance Program on several occasions, but I was never able to be completely honest about the source of my psychological difficulties. I had to discuss my symptoms in vague terms and allow the counselor to draw conclusions about possible causes that had nothing to do with the real source of my distress. The counseling sessions were frustrating because I desperately wanted help in dealing with the guilt and anxiety that were consuming my life, but I could not reveal the true cause of my problems without exposing my criminal activities and destroying what remained of my career and reputation. I tried various approaches to managing my emotional difficulties, but nothing could address the fundamental problem of living with such a terrible secret. During the middle years of my career, I began to consider the possibility of making an anonymous tip that might lead investigators to Sarah's remains without directly implicating Walsh or myself in her death. However, I was never able to develop a plan that seemed likely to succeed without creating risks that I was unwilling to accept, particularly given Walsh's continuing presence on the force and his ability to implicate me in the cover-up if he suspected that I was considering revealing our secret. I also worried about the forensic evidence that might be recovered with Sarah's body if it were discovered, and whether advances in investigative technology might make it possible to connect Walsh and me to her death even if we were not directly implicated by whoever discovered her remains. This concern became more acute as DNA analysis and other forensic techniques became more sophisticated and widely available. The relationship between Walsh and me became increasingly strained over the years, as the shared burden of our secret created tension and resentment that affected our ability to work together effectively. We both knew too much about each other's involvement in criminal activity to maintain the friendship we had once enjoyed, and every interaction between us was colored by the knowledge of what we had done together. Walsh seemed to handle the psychological pressure of our secret better than I did, or at least he was more successful at concealing the impact that it had on his emotional state and professional performance. This difference in our responses to the stress of maintaining our lies created additional resentment on my part, as I felt that he had been able to move on with his life while I continued to struggle with guilt and anxiety about our involvement in Sarah's death. However, I later realized that Walsh was probably dealing with his own psychological difficulties related to our cover-up, and that his apparent success in managing these problems might have been as much of a facade as my own attempts to maintain normal professional and personal relationships while carrying such a terrible burden. When Walsh retired from the department in 2018, I felt both relief and increased anxiety about the future of our secret. His departure removed the daily reminders of our shared crime and reduced the tension that his presence had created in my work environment. However, his retirement also meant that I could no longer monitor his emotional state and ensure that he remained committed to maintaining our silence about Sarah's death. I worried that Walsh might decide to confess our involvement in covering up Sarah's death as part of some attempt to find peace with himself during his retirement years. I also feared that he might try to minimize his own culpability by placing greater blame on me for the decisions that had been made during those crucial hours when we chose to conceal her death rather than report it to authorities. During my final years of active duty, I began to consider the possibility of retiring early to escape from the constant stress of working in law enforcement while carrying such a terrible secret about my past criminal activities. However, I was also concerned that early retirement might raise questions about my motivations and might draw unwanted attention to my career and personal life. The discovery of Sarah's remains in 2024 was the news I had been dreading for 14 years, But it was also a relief to know that the secret I had been carrying for so long was finally going to be exposed, and that I would no longer have to live with the constant fear of being discovered. The advances in forensic science that I had worried about for so many years had finally made it impossible to maintain the lies that had defined my life since that terrible night in October 2010. When investigators began questioning me about my knowledge of Sarah's case following the discovery of her remains, I initially attempted to maintain the same lies I had been telling for 14 years. However, the evidence that had been recovered with her body and the forensic analysis the decision to finally confess was made easier by the realization that I could no longer bear the psychological burden of maintaining my lies, and that providing Sarah's family with the truth about what had happened to their daughter was more important than protecting myself from the consequences of my actions. I also recognized that Walsh's confession had made my own involvement in the cover-up impossible to conceal, and that cooperation with investigators was my only option for potentially receiving some consideration for my eventual cooperation. During my confession, I provided investigators with complete details about my involvement in covering up Sarah's death, including my participation in moving her car and disposing of evidence, my lies during the original investigation, and the psychological impact that maintaining this secret had on my life and career over the past 14 years. I want to emphasize that while I was not responsible for Sarah's death, I was fully responsible for the decisions I made to help conceal her death and to lie to investigators who were trying to find her and provide her family with answers about her fate. These decisions were motivated by fear, misguided loyalty, and self-preservation rather than any legitimate law enforcement purpose. I also want to acknowledge the terrible harm that my silence caused to Sarah's family, who spent 14 years wondering what had happened to their daughter and hoping for her safe return. They deserved to know the truth about Sarah's fate much sooner than they ultimately received these answers, and their suffering during these years of uncertainty was prolonged by my decision to prioritize my own interests over their need for closure. Sarah Mitchell deserved so much better than she received from the law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect and serve the public. Instead of receiving professional help for her problems with drug dependence and chronic pain, she became involved in an inappropriate relationship with an officer who abused his authority and ultimately caused her death during a confrontation that should never have occurred. My failure to report Sarah's death immediately when I first learned of it represents a betrayal of my oath as a law enforcement officer and a violation of the trust that the community had placed in me to seek justice and protect the innocent. I allowed my fear and personal loyalty to override my professional obligations, and I participated in a cover-up that prevented Sarah's family from receiving the closure they deserved. I hope that my confession can provide some measure of accountability for my actions and some additional clarity about the circumstances that led to Sarah's death and the cover-up that followed. While I recognize that no amount of explanation or remorse can undo the harm that was caused by my criminal actions, I want Sarah's family to know that I have carried the burden of guilt about my involvement in concealing her death every day for the past 14 years. The resolution of Sarah's case has finally allowed me to stop living the lies that have consumed my life since October 2010, but it has also forced me to confront the full magnitude of the harm that was caused by my decisions during those crucial hours when I chose to help cover up her death rather than seek justice for a young woman who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her. Officer Maria Santos had finally revealed her role in the cover-up that had prevented Sarah Mitchell's family from learning the truth about her death for 14 years. Her confession exposed the devastating impact that fear and misguided loyalty had on her ability to fulfill her obligations as a law enforcement officer sworn to protect and serve the public, and demonstrated how individual choices during critical moments can have far-reaching consequences for innocent victims and their families. The psychological burden of maintaining such a terrible secret had affected every aspect of Santos' personal and professional life, creating a cycle of guilt, anxiety, and deception that had consumed her thoughts and emotions for nearly a decade and a half. Her eventual confession provided additional evidence of the systematic failures that had surrounded Sarah's death and the cover-up that had followed, revealing the complex web of fear, manipulation, and moral compromise that had allowed Walsh to maintain his lies for so many years. Santos' account also demonstrated the devastating impact that Walsh's crime had not only on Sarah and her family, but also on the people who became unwilling accomplices to his deception and who were forced to carry the burden of his secret while struggling with their own guilt and fear about the consequences of their involvement in concealing the truth about what had happened during that terrible night in October 2010. Her confession served as a reminder of the importance of maintaining professional integrity and moral courage even in the face of pressure from colleagues or fears about personal consequences, and highlighted the terrible cost that can result when law enforcement officers prioritize personal loyalty over their sworn duty to seek justice and protect the innocent members of the community they serve. In March 2024, construction workers renovating a house that had belonged to retired Officer James Walsh made a discovery that would finally solve the 14-year mystery of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. While digging to install a new foundation in the backyard, the crew uncovered human remains that had been carefully buried beneath what had once been a garden shed. The forensic investigation that followed was swift and thorough, utilizing advanced DNA analysis techniques that had not been available during the original investigation in 2010. Within days, investigators confirmed that the remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell, the young nurse who had vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine night at Cedar County Hospital. The condition of Sarah's remains and the forensic evidence recovered from the burial site told a clear story of violence and deliberate concealment. The blunt force trauma to her skull was consistent with a fatal head injury, and the careful burial indicated that her death had been covered up by someone who understood the importance of hiding evidence from law enforcement investigators. Detective Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases using modern investigative techniques, immediately recognized the story he had maintained for 14 years about having no knowledge of Sarah's whereabouts or activities on the night she disappeared was clearly contradicted by the forensic proof that she had died on his property and been buried in his backyard. Faced with the impossibility of continuing his deception, Walsh finally confessed to his role in Sarah's death and the elaborate cover-up that had followed. His confession revealed not only the circumstances of her death, but also the systematic abuse of his authority as a law enforcement officer and the devastating impact that his lies had on everyone who had loved and cared about Sarah. The confession also implicated Officer Maria Santos in the cover-up, leading to her own arrest and eventual admission of guilt for her role in concealing Sarah's death from investigators and her family. Santos' confession provided additional details about the night of Sarah's death and the psychological toll that maintaining such a terrible secret had taken on both officers over the course of 14 years. The investigation revealed that Sarah's death had resulted from Walsh's inappropriate relationship with someone he was supposed to be helping through official channels, and that her death could have been prevented if Walsh had followed proper procedures for handling the drug theft case, rather than creating an informal arrangement that served his own emotional needs. The discovery also exposed significant failures in the original investigation, as investigators had never seriously considered the possibility that Sarah might have been killed by someone within law enforcement. Despite the obvious access that police officers had to information about the case and the resources necessary to conceal evidence effectively, Sarah's family, who had spent 14 years wondering what had happened to their daughter and hoping for her safe return, finally received the answers they had desperately sought for so long. However, the revelation that she had been killed by a police officer who was supposed to protect and serve created additional layers of grief and betrayal that compounded their suffering. Sarah's fiancé, who had made numerous public appeals for information about her disappearance over the years, expressed both relief at finally knowing her fate and anger at the officers who had deceived him and everyone else who had searched for Sarah while knowing exactly what had happened to her. The case prompted a comprehensive review of the Cedar County Police Department's procedures for handling internal investigations and oversight of officer conduct, particularly in cases involving relationships between law enforcement personnel and individuals who were subjects of criminal investigations. The revelation that two respected officers had been capable of covering up a death for 14 years raised serious questions about the culture within the department and the effectiveness of existing mechanisms for detecting and preventing misconduct by law enforcement personnel. Walsh and Santos both faced serious criminal charges for their roles in Sarah's death and the subsequent cover-up, including charges related to obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and abuse of their authority as law enforcement officers. The legal proceedings that followed provided additional details about the case and ensured that both officers would be held accountable for their actions. The community of Cedar County, which had been divided for years between those who believed Sarah had disappeared voluntarily and those who suspected she had been the victim of foul play, finally had definitive answers about what had happened to the young nurse who had dedicated her life to caring for others. Sarah Mitchell was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of community members, hospital colleagues, and family members who had never stopped hoping for her safe return. The service celebrated her life, her dedication to nursing, and her memory while acknowledging the tragedy of her premature death and the injustice of the years of uncertainty that had followed. The case served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest threats to public safety come not from strangers or career criminals, but from those who have been entrusted with the authority to protect and serve the community. Sarah Mitchell had been killed not by a random predator, but by a police officer who abused his position and betrayed the trust that had been placed in him. The resolution of Sarah's case also highlighted the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and following proper procedures in all law enforcement activities, particularly when dealing with vulnerable individuals who may be dependent on police officers for guidance and assistance during difficult periods in their lives. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, can eventually be served even when powerful individuals believe they have successfully evaded accountability for their crimes. Sarah Mitchell's story will serve as a lasting reminder of the importance of truth, accountability, and the never-ending pursuit of justice for all victims of violence, regardless of who committed the crimes against them. The truth about Sarah Mitchell's death had finally been revealed after 14 years of lies and deception, providing closure for her family and justice for a young woman whose only crime was trusting the wrong person during the most vulnerable period of her life. Subscribe to uncover more stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten.